Floor is yours.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm sorry, I'm trained by TED Talks to always try to be in front, away from a lectern. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me in Istanbul. I must say I'm sorely tempted to throw out my entire presentation about airports and talk about parks, public space, and networked urbanism, but perhaps we can get to that in the Q&A. And also, I have to say, I feel like I'm at the center of the world right now, at least in urbanism circles. But I think, as he very much eloquently stated in his introduction, and also as no doubt you made aware of the last 3 weeks, this I sort of start as the opening statement of the presentation, that the 20th century belonged to the nation state, the 21st century belongs to the city. You know, of course, the 20th century was the century of wars, of the Cold War, of geopolitics, and empire. And the 21st century, we seem to realize now, belongs to the city as the defining unit where innovation happens, where growth happens, where jobs are created, where immigrants are sort of integrated into society. The city, how we govern it, how we build it, how we place it, these are sort of the issues that are going to define this century, and this is a sort of unit we're going to have to grapple with. And this statement has been made by many times by many leaders over the last few years. But this particular case is interesting because Lee Myung-bak is the former president of South Korea now. But before that, he was the mayor of Seoul, and so you can sort of see where his true loyalties lie. That and the fact that I was present when he actually said these words. We were there for the opening of a new city. This is Songdo off the coast of Korea. It's a $35 billion privately developed city built from scratch on a man-made island in the Yellow Sea off to the southwest of Seoul. It's interesting, Songdo is not a Korean city. It was designed to be a Western city floating off the coast of Korea, created for multinational corporations and their expatriate workers who could live there, which is why, for example, the towers, of course, are designed by Western architects, KPF and HOK, and the golf course is by Jack Nicklaus. If you're going to build a golf course in Asia, it has to be Jack Nicklaus. The city itself has become a branded luxury good. And its design is sort of borrowed from the best of various cities that we all know and love. So in this particular case, the Central Canal is borrowed from Venice. Its street grid and Central Park are modeled on Manhattans, where the architects live and work. And it has other features. There's a performing arts center modeled on Sydney's Opera House. And so in creating Songdo, rather than try to build a perfect city, they decided, the architects, they would try to build one that would remind its residents of where they had come from. But the most salient fact about Songdo, its feature that matters the most is, I don't know if I have a laser pointer, is this bridge up here. 12 kilometers long, it's one of the longest in the world, and it connects across open water to Seoul Incheon International Airport, in this case showing the new Terminal 2. Songdo is a textbook example of what I call in my book an aerotropolis. It is a city that is designed from scratch around the airport, or it's a city that sprung up in relation to its airport. What's interesting about Songdo is that even though it has metro lines that connect it to Seoul and Incheon, an urban agglomeration of 32 million people, its location, its whole reason for existence, the reason it was able to raise $35 billion in capital markets is because of its relationship to the airport. It was designed, I believe, I have the slide, yes, the whole point of coming to Songdo is that you could essentially fly to anywhere in Northeast Asia. The entire city is an aerial gateway with 2-hour flights to Beijing, 2.5 to Shanghai, 2 hours to Tokyo. And so if you live in Songdo, you can go anywhere, which is a very fascinating proposition. We, of course, choose cities for the places that we want to root ourselves in, but in Songdo and in other aerotropolises, it's the connectivity that itself is key. And so, I always ask my audiences, the subtitle of my book is The Way We'll Live Next, which is much a question and a challenge as it is a statement. Is this the way we'll live next in these sort of generic cities that are being built, cities with no past and an uncertain future? Well, I think before we can answer that question, we should look at how we built cities in the past. I think Songdo and the Aerotropolis is really part of a greater tradition. Of course, the Ottoman Turkish Empire was never particularly known for being a seafaring power. I don't particularly associate it with great navies, and yet, the Ottoman Turks, essentially conquered the trade routes from the Venetians. This is the Battle of Lepanto from 1571, where Christendom eventually felt so threatened by the Turkish navy that it had to engage it. And of course, Istanbul, Constantinople was one of the great ports and great seafaring places of the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. This This is a city, not defined by its metros, but literally defined by its harbors here on the Golden Horn. Or there on the Golden Horn, I should say. And so to me, it's interesting that when we're talking about an aerotropolis and a city built from scratch around transportation, I think we can actually find a direct link between, of course, the galleys of Lepanto and now the 777s and narrow bodies of Turkish Airlines. It's only the sense that the scale and the technology has changed. The patterns are actually very similar over hundreds of years. So the reason that we're talking about air travel now and why air travel is so important is because air is the only scale of transportation that's truly global. And that's what got me interested in this subject and using it to talk about cities. Because if we're going to talk about globalization, which is a word that we throw around without ever really being able to define or hold in our hand, we can talk about the flat world, we can talk about all sorts of metaphors. But when you talk about globalization, typically you end up talking about two things. You talk about world trade, and you talk about foreign direct investment, and you talk about the falling of trade barriers and the movement of people. These very, very difficult subjects to grasp. And so this shows you in a single chart what globalization has looked like. To me, what's interesting about air travel is that you can use it as a proxy. You can use it to see how flows of goods and people and information and money actually move across the globe. So for example, when it comes to actually manufactured goods and the flow of goods, you can use air freight and air cargo as a very almost close exact proxy to it. One of the interesting statistics that I find always is that a third of all the goods in the world by value, so by the dollar figures that we put on it, travels by air, and that comprises only 1% of the weight. The most valuable things that we make and trade and sell are the things that actually travel the fastest and the furthest by air, versus, of course, all the commodities that go by boat. And the same is true for people too. What's interesting about air travel is that despite 4 decades of oil crises, war, epidemics, and financial crises, we've seen an uninterrupted growth in air travel. Globalization, the era of globalization, is an era in which we fly more and more of us all the time. And you can see that in economics as well. This is, in particular case, the U.S. service trade. We've seen during that period a huge surge in U.S. exports of services, which translates to what exactly? How do we export services? Well, that's this guy. It's essentially the frequent flyer. We are all exporting ourselves whenever we fly anywhere to do business. And so what's interesting is that that we've really not yet begun to fly. We think that even though urbanization rates here in Turkey and in the West are quite high, globally we've not really yet begun to urbanize. As I was discussing there, that that we were barely 50% urbanized as a species, going to 85%, and this is very true of air travel as well. We've really not yet begun to fly. So you can see on this graph, for example, this shows a wealth, and this shows frequent flyerdom. And so, of course, I don't know where Turkey is on here exactly, but here's, of course, developed nations. The wealthier you are, the more you fly, by and large. And so what's interesting about this is that when you look at the world average, here are all the BRIC nations here. Brazil, India, China, all of them are posting 20% growth rates when it comes to flight. Only 2% of Indians have ever flown. So as these nations become wealthier and become more urbanized, we're going to see even greater growth patterns when it comes to air travel. And so, they will simultaneously take to the skies as they build their cities. And just the point of this, I always encounter this in the United States in particular, and sometimes in Europe, this pessimism that we're going to keep flying as much, that whether because of peak oil or because of climate change or because of environmental cap and trade, that we're going to see a decline in air travel. This hasn't really been the case. There's no evidence to actually support this. This shows that even though that increasing prices because of oil puts a damper on air travel growth, a growing economy means it grows even further. So this is why despite we have triple-digit barrels of oil, $100, 100 euros, on the Brent exchange, we're still seeing huge surges of air travel in the developing world. And the same goes. You can see it in these two crazy graphs. This shows the relationship between passenger growth over the last 20 years, and this actually shows the run-up in oil prices. So you can tell that there's almost no relationship between the two, despite the fact that we've seen oil prices triple in the last decade since the U.S. invasion of Iraq. We have not, in fact, seen any fall-off in either passengers or cargo. We are still taking to the skies at unprecedented rates, and there appears to be sort of no bounds on the rate in which we will do so. So, this is interesting when it comes to cargo. Just a brief aside on why we're sending more and more goods aloft. This is sort of the same part of economics. It has never ever gotten cheaper to send anything by air. In fact, it's only gotten more expensive over time. What's changed is that the value of the things that we send has gone up so much. So, for example, if we look at, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a phone was a lump of plastic, and full of copper wire. And today, of course, it's the iPhone 5, which is a phone that's somewhere between $300 and $1,000, for example. And so, because it's so valuable to have the iPhone 5, it's still cheaper to manufacture it in China. And even if you pay more to ship it, halfway across the globe, that's still a tiny fraction of the value of this, which is why you're seeing growth patterns like this. This sort of shows, this is a little bit wonky, I apologize, but primary goods are the raw materials of trade. Final goods are goods like the iPhone 5 itself. But what's really surging in global trade are the intermediate goods, which are the components, which is all of the electronics that go into the phone. And this is why all the discussions about bringing manufacturing back to developed nations is ultimately bound to falter, because all of the component manufacturers for this phone are in China and Japan and Korea. In the US, we talk a lot about wanting to bring manufacturing back. In fact, the next MacBook laptop will be made in the United States, will be assembled there. It doesn't really matter, because all of the components will be made and then airshipped in from Asia. And this has remade the economics of these regions. So, for example, this is where the iPhone 5 was made, the gigantic Foxconn plant in Shenzhen on the coast of China. 500,000 people working in one complex as large as a city. These are famous Ed Bertansky photographs, by the way. And today what's interesting is that basically Apple has up and moved its entire operation. Today, factories like this are no longer in Shenzhen. They're in Zhengzhou, which is a city that's 1,000 miles inland, where they're building a 415 square kilometer aerotropolis designed to move these iPhones at the same global scales. China, of course, is building hundreds of cities from scratch. Cities like this is the Lanzhou New area in the northern desert, where they're essentially going to build a version of Pudong around the airport. So they're going to build a Shanghai from scratch, and they are blasting mountains in the background. They're going to level more than 300 hills to create the land flat enough to actually expand their airport and build. So if you think chopping down 1 million trees for Istanbul's airport is a bit extreme, the Chinese have you beat. What's interesting about this is about sort of the shifting economic center of the world, and you can sort of see why China is leading the way in building all these airports. This shows sort of the economic center of gravity in 1980. So if you imagine, all the countries of the world sort of tugging at global finances, in this case, the United States has pulled the economic center away from Europe. What was interesting is that by 2007, that economic center was moving rapidly east, and by 2049, it'll be in Western China. In fact, it won't be very far from this spot, which is Chongqing, the Chicago of the East. They call it that because it's growing at 8 times the speed as Chicago did in the 19th century, which set patterns as the fastest growing city of its era. So today, Chongqing is a city of 32 million people. That's partly because its official boundaries are about the size of Austria. It's a gigantic city on paper. But that's still 6 million people in its urban core, and it's adding 300,000 people a day. I don't know what the equivalent is for sort of Istanbul's rates. The United States, that'd be the equivalent of adding Pittsburgh to the edges of Chongqing day after day after day. And that's part of the sort of larger Chinese plan to urbanize 400 million people over the next 20 years. They're essentially going to change the legal status of their peasants, move them out of villages into cities where they can create jobs, run social services, and essentially more efficiently organize people. And to do so, in the course of doing this, of course, its GDP is 17%, because Chongqing is having to build housing factories at an unprecedented scale. The problem with the scenario, though, is that Chongqing is, of course, one of the most remote cities in China. It's 1,000 miles upriver from Shanghai on the Yangtze. It was so remote that, it was the wartime capital when Japan invaded in the 1930s. And now, of course, they want to try to build a global city from scratch in the middle of nowhere in a society that, of course, was closed for thousands of years. And this is why Chongqing has also massively expanded its airport, started its own airline, because China, among others, has realized that if it wants to connect to the world and participate in the global economy, it'll have no choice but to do it by the air and to invest in the infrastructure to do so. India, I should add, is doing something very similar right now as well. They're building a project you may have heard of called the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. This is a rail line literally between the two cities, along which they intend to build 12 cities of 2 million people, including 7 international airports and several aerotropolises that will build several of the cities around the airport itself. Because India has lagged far behind when it comes to urbanization, only 29% of the country. And again, they need to create millions of industrial jobs to actually create work for the farmers they're displacing. And so India, too, is essentially turning to the air to connect these new cities into the global economy. And so what is the rationale behind this? I know, it's very much a topic of concern right now, the notion of, why Istanbul, among other cities, is massively expanding its urban footprint, building new towers, discussing the whole construction of office space. In New York, we're having a debate right now during the end of the Bloomberg administration, where there's plans to essentially tear down and rebuild large chunks of the east side of Manhattan, because it is argued that we are falling behind to London and Shanghai and Hong Kong in a lack of Class A office space. The reason behind all of this sort of discussion of this about why we need to build world-class cities and discussions of competitiveness has its roots in images like this. This is a graph I borrowed from a McKinsey presentation from the McKinsey Global Institute. This is their book on cities. Basically what they argue is that over the next 15 to 20 years, only 100 cities in metropolitan areas on the planet will capture a third of all growth. That's their City 100 right here. And then the next 500 cities will collect the next third of global growth. And if you're not in one of those 600 cities, you essentially don't exist. You disappear into the long tail of urbanism. And so the notion is that these 600 cities will be the winners of the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so you had best spend the infrastructure necessary, do the regulatory, do the governance to be one of those cities, or else you're lost. And what's interesting about this list, and this is McKinsey sort of speaking particularly to its clients in the US and Europe, is that today those 100 cities include 70 cities in the developed world. I assume Istanbul is one of them. I don't have the list handy. And a handful of those are sort of developing world cities, and only 3 of the 26 megacities mentioned fall into that camp. What I find really interesting, though, is this is their graph of how that's going to change by 2025. So only a quarter of developed world cities will be in that. But the big winners will not be megacities. There's only going to be 8 of those out of the entire 100. So that Chongqing perhaps will be one of those 8. The remainder will be, small to, be in the developing world and emerging markets, and will be small to mid-sized cities, which of course is the 1 to 10 million people. As someone from the US, I find it ironic that a small city would be 3 million people, but there you have it. And to me, what I take away from this is that the winners of the 21st century, those cities that will triumph and be in the City 100, will not be the biggest cities. It will be the best connected ones. It will be the ones that tie into the networks of global trade and talent and wealth and goods and information. And so how those networks are being developed, how do you plug into them, that to me is the great question facing any city. And that's where I sort of started my investigation of air travel, because you can literally see in air networks those networks forming. So here's a course of global air patterns around the globe. United States, Europe, there's Istanbul, and Northeast Asia. And to me, the most interesting fact on this chart, the most unprecedented part of it, was the creation of this hub here, which, as you can imagine, is Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, where the massive investment in their airlines has created an air hub in the center of the world where none had ever existed. And you can see more closely here, sort of the formations of the major hub networks of Europe. Here's Istanbul here, and then here's an even closer look at the big 3 in the Middle East. So I want to take you through a few examples, I guess, of the networks that are forming, of sort of what I've been investigating and what air travel can do for a city and a region. Here you can see, for example, massively developed China and Japan, while India, of course, is mostly dark. But here's a stylized map of basically the Gulf region 10, 12, 13 years ago. In 2000, of course, there was Emirates Airlines and Qatar Airways, and both were mostly modest regional carriers, with some international links to Europe and, of course, the major capitals of Asia. 11 years later, however, they'd been joined by a third airline, Etihad, out of Abu Dhabi, whose first order for aircraft was $20 billion up front. And by then, they were essentially connected to every major region on the planet. You can fly from Manchester to Dubai in an Emirates A380 and then connect onward to Australia or anywhere in Asia. Or, if you're in Dar es Salaam or Accra in Africa, you can connect through Dubai or Qatar or Doha on your way to China. They've essentially reforged, of course, the Silk Road, that for 1,000 years in antiquity ran between China and all points in Africa. And now that Silk Road, the new Silk Road, is going by air through the Middle East. So we'll get to the discussion of Istanbul in a moment, because Istanbul is, of course, the great challenger to this hierarchy that's forming. But I enjoy Dubai as one of my favorite sort of cities on the planet because it's so surreal for me as an American. If you've never had the chance, I highly recommend you go to Dubai Terminal 3, Emirates' home hub, at midnight, which is actually busier than any time of day. This is when their overnight operation is at its peak. And of course, you'll see native Emiratis and their dish dashas. You'll find Chinese laborers who are being shipped off to Africa to build infrastructure. You'll You'll find Indian traders bound for home from Africa, and so forth. You'll find African traders headed to China themselves to buy wholesale goods. And of course, you don't even have to actually go to China to buy Chinese goods now. You can go to a place like Dragon Mart, which is the largest wholesaling hub for Chinese goods outside of Africa. You can find any sort of cheap Chinese-made good you want. And if you can't find it there, they're actually building a second version of it that's 3 times larger directly across the street from it. In this case, I find it interesting because Dubai has recovered from its 2009 financial crisis by essentially becoming a Chinese city outside of China. There's over 2,000 Chinese firms that are there now, and essentially 150,000 Chinese in the city. And what's interesting is that when China, of course, set out on its great initiative a decade ago to go into Africa, and essentially colonize is a strong word, but to essentially massively build infrastructure there, Wen Jiabao, the then premier of China, personally chose the first air route. It was to Lagos via Dubai. And today, of course, there are now more Chinese in Nigeria than there were Britons at the height of the empire. So you can see how air routes have played a pivotal role in this, and played a pivotal role in sort of China's direct investment to the Arab world. In 2000, China's exports in material goods was $6 billion to the entire Middle East. Today, it's $60 billion and more. This to me is interesting because as an American, in 2000 it was $48 billion, and today it's only $54 billion. This is in part because, of course, I like to think, U.S. visa policy, where after 9/11, the United States panicked and we essentially closed out many of the world's most talented people, and instead we saw the creation of the new Silk Road via Dubai. And of course, Dubai is building the infrastructure to match this. Dubai International will probably overtake London this year. London Heathrow has the busiest international airport on the planet, and that isn't good enough for Dubai. To accommodate the massive expansion of Emirates, which has a third of all A380s ever built on order, and has the sort of largest, fastest-growing long-haul fleet in the entire world. They're building a new airport. This is Dubai World Central, the first runway, which over time will eventually sort of be an aerotropolis in its own right, and be connected to the port at Jebel Ali and the massive free zone there. It'll become the sort of largest single integrated logistics complex in the world. And while Istanbul hopefully has the Olympics in 2020, Dubai is bidding for Expo 2020, which will have its site at Dubai World Central. And so these are some of the renderings of how they imagine, speaking of TED, what a Dubai Expo will look like in the middle of its aerotropolis. And it's not just goods that are being traded to this, and it's not just part of the strategies of Abu Dhabi and Doha. I mean, as you may be familiar, of course, with Saadiyat Island, which is Abu Dhabi's attempt to build its own sort of arts complex on its own island. So, of course, there's a Guggenheim designed by Frank Gehry. There's a Louvre designed by Zaha Hadid. It turns out that for only $1 billion, you can franchise the Louvre. The downside of that, apparently, is that the art is an extra $500 million a year. Of course, Abu Dhabi is good for it. And so they are using their air connectivity via Etihad to essentially fly in not just sort of art lovers, but also students. They've built an entire branch of NYU, where I'm a visiting scholar. So essentially, rather than having the world's smartest students fly to the US and New York for a college education, they can now come to Abu Dhabi, where they can also remain behind and start businesses. They're using their air connectivity to attract the world's students. And they're not alone in this. Doha, of course, is doing the same thing. They've built an entire education city, as they call it, where they're assembling pieces of US and other universities. So, of course, there's Texas A&M, George Mason, chunks of universities from Russia. They're using education as their own sort of attractor, and using Qatar Airways as their ability to bring this talent in. And they're building their own aerotropolis. This is the new Doha International Airport, which, a bit like Berlin, is slated to open any day now, perhaps, sometime. Endless delays. But they hired Rem Koolhaas, the Dutch architect, who's building an aerotropolis for them, a linear city along the edge of the airfield with logistics, hospitals, headquarters units, world-class architecture, an entire city unto itself for those who want to be close to the airport. And the UAE has its own export. This is, to me, the most interesting network of all that's forming. And it's not oil to Bangkok and Singapore, it's hospital patients. These are the places that pioneered in medical tourism. I know Istanbul has a famous hospital for it as well. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But the UAE decided 10 years ago that it was actually cheaper than building its own hospitals and its own world-class medical center to simply fly all of its government civil servants to Bangkok and Singapore as needed for surgery. And so you saw the creation of a place like Bumrungrad, which is the first hospital on the planet that has more international patients than domestic ones. Its staff speaks 26 languages, serves people from over 80 countries, and for, again, being an American where we don't have nationalized health insurance, it has a particular draw for clientele who can't afford surgery back in the United States. So places like that in Bangkok General across town where you can see, Americans in shorts hanging out with men in dishasha, these are places where you can actually get world-class medical treatment using stem cells for heart surgery and everything else, all of which leverages Thailand's air infrastructure from tourism. So they're able to create essentially a whole new business from scratch out of the fact that they already have air links. And in the case of Bumrungrad, what they did was they actually vertically integrated with the airlines. So now they work with the airlines to create tourism packages into the hospital. And Bumrungrad is not just a hospital, it has a 5-star hotel attached, it has apartments, a complete infrastructure for its clients. And India has gotten in on the same thing. It's interesting, there's hospital chains called Apollo and Fortis in cities across India. I was fortunate enough to run into the CEO of the Fortis Hospital Group a few years ago in Las Vegas, another major city that only exists because of its air travel routes, a city in the desert. And he was explaining to me that the reason Fortis has been able to build all of these hospitals in India is because of the incredible air capacity that was placed into Bangalore by outsourcing. The fact that all of these American and Western companies needed to actually occasionally fly to Bangalore to oversee their operations meant this tremendous boom in air travel, which they were again able to leverage very cheaply to bring in medical tourists. So you can sort of see the unintended consequences and all the new sort of urban forms that are springing up because of all of this air travel. So, the whole premise of my book, where I started from this, is that if globalization is this force, and air travel is the only physical realization of this force, then sooner or later we would see cities start to form around airports, just as we saw them form around ports and harbors and railroads and other forms of transportation. We would start to see something appear. And that's what we are starting to see around the world. I'm going to walk you through a few very concrete examples of what developers have done around airports. This just shows you still the importance of connectivity to business. I find this fascinating because, Helsinki and Stockholm are some of my favorite cities in the world. I'm vacationing in Stockholm next week. These are cities that top every major indice of livability and great cities on the planet, and businesses could care less. They'd rather go to Frankfurt, which is a city that if a banker designed it, that's what you'd end up with. One of the most boring cities I've ever been to. But Frankfurt has more connections than any other city on the planet, 192. And this is a city that has never been the capital nor the largest city in Europe. It's simply the home hub of Lufthansa and the financial capital. And so, there you have this massive connectivity that's forming. And so at Frankfurt, you have the square. This is a building here in the foreground that's longer than the Empire State Building is tall. It sits astride Frankfurt's high-speed rail hub station, and you could argue it's perhaps the best connected building in Europe. It has multiple hotels, multiple office space. It also has the headquarters of KPMG Europe, which consolidated 2,500 accountants there from offices across Europe several years ago. Because the premise is that they can essentially fly anywhere on a moment's notice, or they can bring clients to them. For professions like, accounting, consulting, finance, a building like the Square has an obvious appeal. Its connectivity is purer than any other place in Frankfurt. And over time, we've seen this sort of metastasize from single buildings into complexes. So this sort of shows, the evolution of the airport model. So, of course, first you had the airport, and then, you built facilities around the terminals. You added shopping, you built hotels, parking. And then, then you had what's called the airport city, which is where airports began to realize that rather than try to make money from charging airlines, they could make more and more of their money from parking, shopping, offices, and then use that to actually offer better deals to the airlines, which would then cause them to add more service. And you'd get this virtuous circle where you get the hub would become bigger and bigger and would generate all these effects. And then over time, it's evolved into this, what you could call, what are variably called airport cities or airport clusters, or the aerotropolis. Which, by the way, if the reason the Greek sounds unfamiliar, it's because aerotropolis is actually a fake Chinese word that was coined 25 years ago in Zhuhai to define what they were attempting to build. And so, of course, the aerotropolis is its own destination, its own right. And the original one of these, and still really the model, is Amsterdam Schiphol. There, the Dutch were really the first to realize in the 1980s and 90s that an airport was not something that cities had to try to ignore or push to the edge, that you should try to integrate it into the urban fabric and treat it as a strategic asset, not a liability. And so what the Dutch did, they did, in typical Dutch fashion, hyper-rational, they basically arranged the airport to be owned by the cities around it, and they created not one but two different real estate companies to essentially manage the land inside and outside the airport. And so today, by cannily managing the land and acquiring more lands, Schiphol has the highest industrial rents in the entire Netherlands. And 6 minutes away by train is a custom-built business district, the Zuidas, on the south side of the city. This is how Amsterdam has sort of tried to address, that sort of eternal tension between preservation and preserving the character of the city, but then also building the urban fabric needed for large-scale employers, the Class A office space. And so, what's interesting about the Zuidas is that originally they wanted to build it north of the city. But when the banks like ABN AMRO and AkzoNobel heard about this, they rebelled. They threatened to actually leave Amsterdam altogether rather than be isolated from the airport. And so the government relented, and they built the Zuidas on the south side. Again, this is the highway and train line that goes directly to the airport. And so today, this is where sort of the major, global Fortune 500 companies of the Netherlands reside. And this is where the highest office rents are in the entire country. So I always find this an interesting example because you can really see here, this is, the value of that aerial connectivity is made very apparent in cold hard cash in the actual rental prices. And so in the United States, where I'm most familiar with examples, we're doing sort of similar projects as well. This is Atlanta, at least for the moment, the busiest airport in the world until Beijing overtakes it. Formerly on the edge of the United States in particular, we built all sorts of terrible, polluting, noisy things around our airports because, of course, we hate our airports. Who likes living next to an airport? And that included this Ford Thunderbird plant. There was cars made there for 50 years, and it's been sitting there empty for 20. So finally, a local developer acquired the site, remediated it, removed all the contaminated soil and flattened it, and now they're building what's called Aerotropolis Atlanta, which includes the headquarters of Porsche North America. It's going to create 15,000 jobs at full build-out. It's designed to be mixed-use retail, office, parking, and is an attempt to actually make better use of the connectivity of the airport rather than leaving a dead car factory there. Another example is Washington, D.C. This is a Ronald Reagan Airport, very close to the city, just across the Potomac River. The Pentagon is up here to the north. Just across the street from Ronald Reagan is Crystal City. This was a master plan project designed in the 1950s and 60s. It's mostly, as you can tell, really sort of crummy office space, basically chain hotels, a sort of concrete wasteland of urbanism. But what's interesting, again, and it's difficult to see here, is that this is a chart showing all of the commercial real estate for the entire Washington, D.C. metro area. As you can see here, it has the lowest vacancy rates and I believe the highest single square foot asking price of any commercial real estate in the entire region. So again, the value of that connectivity manifests itself in its asking rates. And because it's so valuable, it's actually leading to a change in the urban fabric. They have plans to essentially replace, many of those sort of crummy hotels and all that concrete with parks and with some more open space, an attempt to actually make it more like a city and less like an airport. And I'm hopeful it'll come to pass. I believe they're about to start work on this. Because of course, if you don't plan for it, this is what you get. I mean, this is essentially the vision, I imagine, of what will happen in Istanbul's third airport on the fringes of the city. This is Northern Virginia. This is the Dulles Toll Road leading out to Dulles International Airport. It's interesting, if you look at all these buildings, you can't really tell, but this is where the United States surveillance state is actually headquartered. The reason that all this sprang into existence is that these are mostly defense contractors who were attracted, again, by the connectivity of Dulles. A random fact that I've discovered from my book is that written into their contracts in the 1970s and 80s, when the United States first began ramping up its military apparatus, or at least its final ramping up of its military and security apparatus, is that basically the contractors had to relocate very close to the Pentagon. And so they chose to settle in this corridor between the Pentagon and the airport. Today, this would be the 6th largest city in the United States, but there's essentially no there because it's all parking lots and sprawl and offices, tremendously valuable real estate. And again, they're finally starting, because of the airport, to turn into something more urban and more walkable. They're extending the metro line finally out to the airport. They're going to massively densify the area and create, essentially a Dulles Aerotropolis. The final U.S. example I'll walk you through is Denver. We mentioned at the beginning, this is sort of the largest airport by area in the world, 50 square miles. I'm not sure exactly what the square kilometers would be. And most of it is empty. It's designed by design. It's grass. This was an airport that was moved to the edge of the city so that no one could ever get close to it and no one could ever sue it or complain about the noise. And 15 years later, sure enough, developers have pushed up to the very edge of it. And now the mayor of Denver has declared he wants to build an aerotropolis and begin adding all sorts of facilities to it for logistics, offices. Denver is, of course, one of the largest U.S. air hubs. This is the Francisco Calatrava train station to the city. Of course, it's already over budget. And what Denver has proved, they finally started nonstop air service to a foreign destination. Denver is a huge air hub, but it's almost purely domestic. So finally, they've got their first flight to Tokyo. United started it last week on the 787 Dreamliner, and they estimate that it's worth $142 million a year in economic activity. Just one flight on one route. So once again, I think more indirect proof that you can see, the value of these air routes. And so, of course, that brings me to Istanbul, which is, particularly interesting because I had never thought that anyone would attempt to challenge Emirates and Etihad and Qatar Airways as a battle of the air hub of the world. But that's exactly what Turkish has done and may very well succeed because, by the quirks of aerial geography, Dubai is very well located. You can essentially you can connect any 2 points on the planet through there. But Istanbul, by another quirk, is even better located for Europe because Emirates has to fly very large, of course, wide-body aircraft, 777s. Turkish, the majority of its fleet, are all narrow bodies, so you can have cheaper aircraft, more frequency, and more destinations within Europe, which is why, only second to Lufthansa, Turkish already has more destinations than any other airline on the planet. And it's keeping pace with Emirates itself. This sort of shows the sort of combined number of passengers of the two. So they're neck and neck between Emirates and Turkish. And this is, of course, because Turkish has a very large domestic traffic, which is one of its great advantages. So this comes to the necessity of, building a third airport for Istanbul. I'm familiar with reading it on paper, and I do know that, of course, once again, it would require the construction of a mammoth airport. I saw the tender was 22 billion euros, which includes financing and everything else. But I have no doubt that if Turkish continues on its growth path, which it seems inclined to do, at some point Ataturk will run out very quickly. I mean, Dubai is already coming up against the limits of Dubai International, and will absolutely need Dubai World Central in the next 20 years to accommodate Emirates' growth patterns. But the challenge that, of course, that Istanbul is going to find is the creation of an entire aerotropolis on the edge of the city, a mammoth 6-runway airport, which will require, I believe, you know the statistics better than I in terms of the millions of trees that will be torn down and the amount of landfill. We know from China's example that it can be done and probably will be done. And this will create, both opportunities and, that sort of instant urbanism that I highlighted at Songdo earlier. I mean, this is exactly the kind of growth poles that are being invented to accommodate, Istanbul and its mammoth growth patterns over the next several decades, as well as building that sort of world-class infrastructure necessary to do it. I always find it interesting, for example, that that in America in particular, people claim that Dubai is over; they've written it off. In fact, the Dubai model has spread everywhere, as you're no doubt familiar. Cities across Africa are building their own versions of Dubai, and this, in many ways, would be Istanbul and Turkey's answer to Dubai, a piece of city as pure infrastructure, the city as a technology, is how I like to think of it. The flip side of that statement I showed at the very beginning, the notion that the 21st century belongs to the city, is that increasingly many leaders are turning to urbanism itself as a tool, as a technology. The aerotropolis is not, a fine city to live in. It can be if you do it right, if you develop and you put into it. But the reason you build one is, of course, is because you want to move people and goods with maximum efficiency and maximum frictionlessness. It is, to borrow a wonky term, it's neoliberalism sort of made concrete, made flesh. It is globalization, sort of purest incarnation. Which is why, as a scholar, I find it so interesting to study, and why half the time I'm as excited as I'm as scared as I am excited by it, because it really shows our desires, sort of made concrete, quite literally. So it's not a question of of Istanbul getting an aerotropolis. It will have one. In fact, Sabina is getting one as well. This is a document I acquired yesterday. This is AECOM, if you're familiar with it, of course, the massive global architecture and engineering firm. One of their partners, Chris Choa, is a leading expert in the aerotropolis, and they're offering cities around the world the opportunity to build them. They're building one in, oh God, I'm losing sight. I think they're offering to offer Hall Rio. They're building the Olympic site for Rio as well, and building, aerotropolises around the world. So it will come, and there are opportunities as well as trade-offs involved, and I hope we can discuss that in Q&A, as I am out of slides. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope we can discuss some stuff in Q&A now. Thank you. Any questions? Anyone? Yes.
Okay. I mean, Istanbul is most of the people is debating that we have already two airport,
yes,
which is Atatürk and Sabiha Gökçen, and we know that when the third airport is going to be built, the Atatürk airport is going to be closed down because of the same routes. Is it possible to just extend the capacity of both airport, Atatürk and Sabiha Gökçen, in order to balance the air traffic and also control the growth of the city at the same time, without creating another metropolis in the north of the town?
You can, but it's difficult. I mean, this is I just came from London, where this is, of course, the Heathrow debate rages on, and in that case, of course, London has 4 or 5 main airports, along, Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton, and Stansted, and of course, that's one of the issues. Why don't we expand all of the airports? The problem is this. I mean, from a Turkish standpoint, having Sabina, having a second airport, I don't think that is actually expanding it is workable. Perhaps you could, but what really matters is having a massive connecting hub. This is the value to Turkish. I mean, the stated goal of the airline is to build a sort of single point for Istanbul to channel 100 million passengers a year through its network. Which, if it does, I mean, this makes Istanbul the world's greatest air hub. This is the sort of arms race happening right now in Istanbul and in the Gulf. So in theory, you could make Atatürk that hub. It would require, though, as in the case of Heathrow, massive land appropriation, lawsuits, massive financial recompensation, and then waging into the destruction of people's homes. And to me, this is why I enjoy studying it, because this sort of shows the trade-offs of growth versus preservation. What do we value here? Do we value the growth of the economy above all, or do we set limits on it and say there are boundaries that we simply will not cross? And this is or do we simply ignore the mistakes that we've made and we'll simply build a new airport from scratch, and this time we'll get it right? This is a pattern that has repeated itself over and over for the last 100 years in the US. I've seen this over and over, where every airport that's ever been built has never been big enough in the end, at least of all the major hubs. So you could do it without a Turk. The question is, could you not only get enough land to add several runways, but then could you preserve enough land to add to the functions around it? Possibly. I don't know, I don't actually know the local landowners around to the specifics. Perhaps it is the right course. I'm actually a fan of expanding Heathrow. I think in that particular case, in London, for example, they have to simply accept the mistakes that they made. Building a new airport from scratch on a man-made island in the Thames estuary, I mean, they're estimating that at something like $80 billion in the long run. And then, of course, you have damage to wildlife and environment, which is a situation similar to what Istanbul faces. In the end, and this is, I have faith this will in London, or won't be, I guess, will be debated, will essentially be voted into office. They will elect a prime minister based on the airport issue in part. I think one of the questions right now in Istanbul, of course, is whether there are any checks and balances on how the construction of the new airport and parts of the city are being conducted. Question there. Go back and then over here.
Anıl Körpınar, Türk Real. How do you perceive the Olympics? Does it affect the way to the Aerotropolis thing for Istanbul, or do you think it will ruin the Aerotropolis idea in Istanbul?
No, I think it would justify the Aerotropolis. I mean, we all know from historical experience that I think the real value of an Olympics to a city's leadership is that essentially what Olympics do, and this has been the case in my experience, is that having an Olympics allows you to simply to rally everyone in a city on both sides, the ruling party and in opposition, and say, well, we need to invest in infrastructure because we're having an Olympics. It allows cities to cut through the intractable bureaucracy and allow them to do this. This is what London did, this is what Atlanta and Los Angeles did. And so it creates an excuse and a timeline. It forces you to do it. And of course, the millions of tourists expected will allow them to do that. So no, I think it would definitely, if Istanbul were to get the Olympics, I think it would basically ratify the construction of a third airport because the perceived increase in demand. Los Angeles was able to execute the last expansion of LAX in 1984. Atlanta did the same thing, added several concourses in 96. London didn't, but Athens built a new airport in 2004 ahead of its Olympics. This seems to be the pattern over and over and over. And Beijing built Terminal 3 ahead of the 2008 Olympics. So it absolutely would. So the question then is, of course, is reuse, and what would the sites be? I don't actually know the plans, the proposed Istanbul plans for the 2020 Olympics. Would they build the Olympic Village and other parts in the same sector of the city, or where would they build the facilities for that? No one knows. So no, I think they would be enmeshed, and they would probably build significant parts of the Olympics near it. Other questions? One here.
Good morning. My name is Ilham Yakkum. Thanks very much for the presentation. Two questions. Any word on sustainability, please, for the Aerotropolis? Sustainability. How do you connect the sustainability with the development of Aerotropolis? And second question is any words on the decision-making mechanisms as to the central government, local municipalities, and the public? Is it shut up and wait until we do something, or hey guys, we have something in mind, come and let's debate?
No. Both excellent questions. So sustainability, well, I mean, where to start there? It's interesting to me, sustainability. I included in the book, and I researched this, a very large portion about biofuels and peak oil and climate change, because of course the climate change debate was particularly raging in the United States at the time. And now, of course, in America, we have shale oil, and so now, America talks about energy independence, and we've stopped worrying about it somehow. Obviously, the Aerotropolis is, globalization incarnate, the notion of trying to run an entire global society at scale on oil. And so in many ways, it is sort of the least sustainable thing you can do. At least air travel is. We know that from studying carbon footprints. I think, to make this possible, a vision in which we can all fly, at the rate in which everyone in China or India could fly at the rates that those of us in the developed world do, will require something like biofuels. It will require something, an infinitely replenishable supply of bioproduced fuel from algae or bacteria or some sort of technology that will allow us to do this without, causing irreversible climate change and, avoiding peak oil. In terms of land use patterns, I get asked all the time, what does an Aerotropolis look like? And the true answer of it is it can look like anything you want it to be. I advocate personally, using rail access to airports as an excuse to really build dense transit-oriented development around it and attempt to build more compact growth patterns. This is true in the States where, where development around airports has traditionally been the most automotive driven. And so I think there's an opportunity there to really sort of, do urban infill and try to fix that. It's easier said than done. In terms of decision-making processes, I don't think it's a coincidence, the fact that the nations that have been most aggressive in pursuing the Aerotropolis strategy, namely China and the Middle East nations, are autocracies. Autocracies are able to actually construct things at this scale and are able to finally mesh their operations together. The reason Dubai, for example, has been able to succeed with Emirates and its hub is because one man, Sheikh Ahmed, Sheikh Mohammed's uncle, is the chairman of the airport authority, the chairman of Emirates Airlines, and also the head of the civil aviation. So that's how Dubai was essentially able to create a seamless 24-hour hub, because state capitalism made it possible. And of course, Etihad, $20 billion on aircraft, no real mandate to be profitable. It's interesting that these Gulf states are using it as really sort of infrastructure to bring in tourism and also bring in, sort of the educated, talented workforce that they can't seem to cultivate on their own. And China, of course, is doing this as well. It's built hundreds of airports as part of its infrastructure drive to boost productivity and growth. So in a developed state, it's interesting. I've seen airports are typically sort of the site of dysfunction. They are the point in the city where the city and the airport authority typically butt heads and fight over development. People who run airports don't want the city around it. Most cities don't want to go anywhere near the airport, and yet growth still happens around it regardless. So I think we do need some sort of approach to planning and integrated regional planning. And this is starting to happen. The Dutch have managed to do this very, very well. They've managed to do this without any sort of major debates, where the cities recognize the airport as part of themselves, and they work together quite rationally to do it. But yeah, when it comes to planning large infrastructure, it's not really a mistake that those who can do it by fiat are the ones who are pursuing this most aggressively. Yes?
What are the biggest mistakes What are the biggest mistakes you can do if you build a new metropolis? So what are the mistakes we can learn out of the other countries? The first question. And the second, what do you do with the old air?
Many mistakes can be made. In fact, I spend most of my time, or I spend more time telling cities they should not build an aerotropolis than they should build one. Because the only way to really do it is if you have incredible amount of air service, which Istanbul does with Turkish. But there are many other cities, that proclaim themselves to be an aerotropolis, and then when you look, you see that they don't really have much air service at all. Simply building a city around an airport on the ground is wishful thinking if you don't have the air service to go through it. And so I see, particularly it's interesting, cities in the middle United States like Memphis, Cincinnati, St. Louis, cities that were once great rail hubs and port cities, but have simply fallen off the flight patterns. They're the ones who are desperately trying to get air service and build an aerotropolis, and they shouldn't. The other mistake you can make is to massively overbuild for service that never comes, which is what cities like Montreal did in the 1970s with Mirabel. Saudi Arabia has done this. I mean, it has, I think, several of the world's largest airports by land area are in the kingdom, and Saudi doesn't have the air service to support them, so what's the point? So those are the mistakes. I'm sorry, what was the second question? What do you do with the old airport? The traditional thing now when you build a new mega hub is to close the old one, because airlines won't want to make the move. New airports typically are very expensive, and so of course they try to pass these costs along to the airlines, which rebel, and also those new airports are usually further away from the core of the city. So airlines typically try to stay in place. This is what happened, for example, in Dallas, in the United States, where Southwest Airlines, the world's largest airline by seats, refused to move from their old home, and so they've literally been fighting a war in the U.S. Congress for 40 years. The more traditional example is to simply close the older airport and then redevelop it as a land parcel. This is what happened in Denver, for example, where the largest planned community in America, Stapleton, is being developed on the site of the former airport. And I know that's being discussed for Ataturk. It is being discussed for Heathrow as well. So that's one plan, is to simply turn it over to developers and then develop this massive infill project. Because sooner or later the airports will end up competing with each other, which can be good and is often sort of self-defeating. Question?
My name is Daphne. Just questions from Şener. Just ask one more question. You said that you usually the former airports shutting down. And what are the other developments around there? The offices and then the hotels. Usually people, they don't get their returns, and then you are just shifting the supply and demand to the other side. And then what will be the future of all those investments?
The future for those investments can be quite bleak, and this is why I'm ultimately, for example, in favor of expanding Heathrow in the London debate. So, there are reports put out that, for example, that Heathrow has created 222,000 jobs around it, that are attracted by the airport. They have statistics. I assume that you'd find something similar, perhaps, for Ataturk. The area around Heathrow to the west of Heathrow, away from central London, has 100% more U.S. companies than you would expect to find, 260% more Japanese companies you expect to find. Large multinational corporations have invested very heavily in the areas around Heathrow. And just 2 days ago, Heathrow Airport put out a report arguing that you would endanger the entire thing if you were to close Heathrow. Those companies would not all move to the other side of the city. Many of them would leave London altogether, perhaps for Amsterdam or Paris or Frankfurt, where there's other major air hubs. So it can be very tricky. And this is, I think, one of the decisions to be looked at in expanding Ataturk versus building a third airport is, do you endanger the urban fabric around it? Because in the case of Denver, you can see it there. I've seen these high and dry former airport hotels where I imagine they're not doing so hot. So you risk serious disruption to the commercial real estate fabric if you do that. Yes.
One question. One of the other major projects for Istanbul is the financial center, which is being built on the Asian side, and you mentioned cities like Frankfurt and London, and so I wonder how Aerotropolis translates into new investments. Should we expect further investments in terms of offices and other real estate markets, because we have an Aerotropolis?
Yes, I would imagine either by design or organically, seen over and over, it will generate its own business district around it, its own CBD. It wouldn't be as large as the pure financial district that's being planned, but you can see examples of this everywhere. I mean, Frankfurt has built Gateway Gardens. It has its own sort of office complex. You have the Zeitus in Amsterdam. You have, I could just sort of tick off examples of this, of these various sort of, commercial areas that spring up. It's at Schiphol, where I was 2 days ago. Microsoft has built its Netherlands headquarters in the middle of the airport, and one of its finest offices there. It's in all the design magazines. They've cultivated the World Trade Center at Schiphol, where they have, by design, multiple office towers where there's, I think, at least 3 global Fortune 500 headquarters there. If they plan this, I would, a smart thing to do would be, or to at least start looking at now, what will be the adjacencies for commercial real estate around it, what facilities, programs, everything else. Because, if you don't, it'll spring up into existence. There should be some sort of rational planning for it. Yes?
I'm kind of in conflict. There is also this issue of sharing wealth in different parts of the country. Just a single question: should we actually separate cities into 2 different classes, mega cities and cities that need to be developed? So from your many examples in your presentation, we have seen cities like Washington, Atlanta, which are already overpopulated and dense, which already have their own airports. And we have also seen cities like Dubai and the Chinese cities, which need that investment in order to create those cities and to attract population to these cities. Istanbul is already overpopulated, is already area-wise very, very large. So instead of attracting population to Istanbul, wouldn't it make sense to actually attract that investment to other cities that need the share of the wealth that's being generated in Istanbul?
I know this is the great debate, isn't it? I mean, that's a fascinating question. I think one of the great questions for all cities going forward. From a social justice standpoint, I agree that we should be trying to elevate all cities and we should be pouring development into that. But from what I know from reading economics, I would never call myself an economist, but my understanding of urban economics implies the opposite. You can never have a city that is overpopulated. You can never have a city that is too big. Too big is a matter of degrees. I mean, this is the thing that we've seen. So just an example to walk you back through history, there's an Italian physicist named Cesare Marchetti who did really interesting research on how cities have developed growth patterns over time. And so what he found, for example, was, in ancient Athens, the circumference of the city, or the diameter of the city, was essentially about 9 kilometers, because he realized that you could walk from the center to the edge in 30 minutes and then back from the center of the edge on foot. And then if you look at cities like Istanbul and Berlin over time, the scale of the city has changed. But the time that we spend commuting, traveling, has never changed. We spend about 30 minutes average commuting. What's changed is the actual technology for moving people. And so Marchetti called it Marchetti's constant. This is his whole notion of how urban development goes. And he did a great map of Berlin showing actually concentric rings where it shifted from on foot to horse carts to streetcars to cars and so forth from there. And so the thing I think we should take away from that is that how big a city is defined purely by its transportation technology and policy and connectivity. So a city that's too big is not too big in the sense there's some absolute limit. It's because we failed simply to accommodate that many people with our infrastructure planning and our transportation planning and everything else. A city that invests wisely in all of those things can grow to an indefinite size scale. And we know from urban economics that the more people you can pack into a place, the more talent you create in one place, the more access they have to jobs, the more growth you have. So it's a whole notion of the largest single labor market you can create is going to create the largest amount of growth, rather than creating all these sort of smaller pockets of that. You want to strive to create one large agglomeration. And so I think it's perhaps an unequal outcome, but for the maximum outcome, I think we should strive to create large megacities. And this is leading, this is leading in the United States, to the situation where we have a handful of cities that are doing wonderfully. I mean, it's New York, Washington, Los Angeles, San Francisco in the Bay, Seattle, and a handful of others, and then we have many other struggling smaller cities. And there's a whole argument that a rising tide lifts all boats, if that proverb is accurate here. But yeah, from a social justice standpoint, perhaps we should be trying to develop them. And this is, I think, is a tension. This is a whole policy tension involved. But no, I don't think we should be trying to limit the growth of Istanbul. I think perhaps we should be, investing in smaller Turkish cities, just as we should everywhere. But yeah, I think Istanbul should be planned to accommodate as much growth as possible. I don't know, that again, it comes back to that challenge is, again, do we look at it from sheer economics or from, culture and history as well? Any other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Burak. I've been born in Istanbul and been living in Istanbul since 40 years. And I would like to ask you something. Is there a happiness factor or something which we can compare between cities or in time line of cities? Because I believe Istanbul residents are happier than 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Maybe economically our scale is better or our results are better, but I think we should also concentrate on the social, cultural factors. And Istanbul is not heading toward Europe culturally, which they already have in hand. Like we can make Istanbul open museum, but instead we just put concrete on the historical things and try to head to Dubai. I look like Dubai. We are too much concentrating on numbers rather than social concepts or social targets. And European tourists are choosing Istanbul because Istanbul is not the Arabic world or the Gulf countries. So if we close the gap too much, I believe we will lose our attraction parameter. That's my opinion.
Well, I mean, I could see that. I mean, it's interesting. I was discussing earlier before. The city that Istanbul reminds me the most of is Rome. I mean, for obvious reasons. I think it's both capitals of the Roman Empire, and so I see them with the Hagia Sophia versus St. Peter's, and there's parallels there. And what I think is just interesting is that that Rome, although a much smaller city, is essentially paralyzed by its own past. I mean, it refuses to do anything. They can't even build a metro line because of the archaeological ruins. So I think Istanbul is interesting in the fact that it is embarking on a program of growth and modernization. The question is, what is the right balance between preservation and progress? I think with many good reasons, the current residents of Istanbul believe that the pendulum has swung too far in the way of overbuilding. And I think this is something that every sort of great and wealthy city is going to have to debate. I mean, we have a similar discussion in New York right now too, where the 12 years of the Bloomberg administration are ending. I think many people can point to both successes and failures in Bloomberg. I think Bloomberg as a mayor has failed in the sense of half of the city is the wealthiest city on the planet, and the other 51% of the city, by his own estimates, is essentially in poverty or living close to poverty because the cost of living of New York is so high. So that's a failure. But on the plus side of that, Bloomberg is also, in his administration, has invested massively in designing green public space. I mean, I live near the Brooklyn waterfront, where we're building a massive public park that runs all the way along the water, and so it's an incredible public amenity that I could never afford in private space. And so it's a question of what a city should be investing in and how to do it. And it's interesting because even in your successes, when you create wealth and when you create these great public spaces, you run the risk of gentrification or plutocratization. As I was just reading the other day, the notion that global cities like Paris and London and New York have essentially priced out everyone and are driving all of their people to the periphery. These are the challenges that I don't think that we can address purely through economics alone. I think to your point about happiness, because otherwise you end up with a city that's for the purely rich. I mean, large chunks of New York are essentially becoming second homes for Qataris and Russians, with knock-on effects. And London, I think, knows that even more. And so it'll be interesting. How do we come up with the policies that both protect public space for people and make a city? I mean, maybe you've heard the term the right to the city. I mean, this is a notion that comes out of Henri Lefebvre, the French writer, which is the notion that, that we all have a right to the city, to be remade by the city, to meet others in public space. And that, this is the really challenge right now, is that, the tremendous wealth going into cities is destroying public space. It's privatizing it all the time. And so, one of the things we need to decide as citizens in any democracy is how do we protect public space? Yes.
Gunis, my name. Not only providing public space, it's mostly urbanizing or capitalizing on the natural assets of a city. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about Istanbul, we're talking about a jewel that, with no other example. So what is the level of intelligence that we need in the decision-making process in distracting or enhancing the natural assets of such a very high-class city?
That's a good question. And to be honest, if I had a real answer for that, I would be charging someone in Istanbul $200,000 for a consulting engagement, as Richard Florida and many others have done. I don't know. That is the question. That is the main question. All I can offer is, is that, the Bloomberg administration, again, being familiar with New York, is, they are arguing that they were able to basically, by avoiding politics. This was the way out in the United States, in the case of New York, is that Bloomberg, through his own personal wealth, was able to simply shield himself from party politics and pursue a sort of technocratic version of this. And so his leadership is predicated on the whole notion of, I'm beholden to no one, I don't have to make any promises to anyone because I can appoint my own people. And so therefore he argues that, he can pursue a path of enhancing human capital and attracting and diversifying the businesses and all of that. And that'll be interesting to see what happens when New York goes back to that, when we go back to politics, because, this is the thing, leadership is, of course, always hindered by the fact that we're always playing politics with each other. So I don't know. I don't know the particular case for Istanbul, and I don't know the case in my own home city, what's going to happen once the technocrat sets aside. I do think it's interesting there, the flip side of this is, I'm familiar, not personally, but in terms of reading, the Prime Minister's various proclamations on how people should live their lives. It's very interesting because, although heavy-handed, this is essentially more heavy-handed than what's happening in the States right now. Bloomberg has come under heavy criticism for building what we're calling a nanny state. And I do think it's interesting that many of the examples of the cities here is that Singapore has become an inspiration for China, and I think many other cities that want to develop, and many other nations that want to develop a strong creative talent sector, but not be too democratic in this. How do you build a high-functioning autocracy is one of the projects that's currently underway in Northeast Asia. And so, in New York, it's interesting because Bloomberg won the Lee Kuan Yew Prize. He wins plaudits because he's essentially telling people, you won't drink carbonated soda drinks, no smoking, an incredible amount of bans on various things, and it seems to have succeeded. We'll see if that backpedals, but I don't know if that's not really much of an answer, but I do think that's sort of one of the interesting things, is this sort of notion of being above politics is the current flavor of, an urban leadership program. So, question.
Yusuf Zahid Gündoğdu. My question is related to noise pollution. Mm-hmm. I'm going to give you two examples, and later I want to ask your opinion about comments about the new Istanbul airport. Mm-hmm. Regarding two examples I want to give. First is Nice airport in southern France, and because of the concerns of people about the noise pollution, the airport is situated at the sea coast and quite far away from the city center. And another example is Narita airport in Japan. Because of the concerns of people about the noise pollution, city government decided to situate the airport inside the sea, and nowadays the problem is the land is sinking every year about 20 or 30 centimeter, big engineering problem.
Yeah.
So all these concerns are originated from noise pollution. But sooner or later, even the airport is situated in a location far away from the city center, like Nice. Urbanization approaches in several decades, like happened in Istanbul existing airport. Because several decades ago it was far away from the city center, but now it's very close. But considering the new Istanbul airport, government plans new cities around the airport, around with population, it said 500,000 people. What do you think about this problem?
What, of situating it too far, you mean? Or which
No,
problem?
I mean, in my opinion, is the urbanization should not be allowed in certain distance to the airport to be constructed.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's a question of programs and features. I mean, I inevitably get a question like this. You know, the notion of like, you know, when people hear the word aerotropolis, they imagine houses built under the flight paths and under runways. No, of course not. I mean, that's like showing Songdo at the beginning. I mean, it was built because the airport is there, but it's still, I mean, 12, 15 kilometers away. But you know, because there's a highway running to it, you're there in 15 minutes. And it's similar with like Dulles there. You know, I mean, it's all a question of as much of time as it is of location. You don't need to be next to the airport if you can get to it quite quickly, preferably by rail. So yeah, I mean, in terms of you know of building airports too far away, I mean, the Dutch have a saying, you know, the airport leaves the city follows the airport, and the airport becomes the city. And this is the pattern that has inevitably gone forward. We just refuse to actually do anything about it. So no, I don't think anyone should be lived allowed closely. But that leads to situations like Denver. So you know, Denver, they built, you know, this new airport from scratch. They built it. It could have 12 runways someday if it wanted. It's designed to be the biggest airport in the world if they wanted to build it out. And no one can get within, you know, like within 5 kilometers of actually building a house next to it. And that's because you know, just to get technical on you, you know, the FAA in the United States has what's called noise contours, where they actually use sound meters to actually map all of the sound patterns, all the noise levels around it. And so no one can build too close in areas with high noise. What happened after 15 years was that local developers sued the FAA to move the noise contours in. They wanted to get closer, and so they pushed them to move it closer because, you know, engine technology gets better and it gets a little bit quieter. So sooner or later, you know, people can build commercial developments, and so, you know, what you should build close to the airport is not homes, is not anything that's very noise sensitive. You know, you can build office space or cargo space or anything that, you know, has few people working around it, or you can insulate it, you can do something like that. And also, you know, noise patterns, you know, are all separate patterns. You can be next to a runway and have almost no noise, you know, as long as you're not under that flight path. So, you know, I think, you know, air travel is not as bad as, you know, living next to busy highways. I mean, a lot of the development patterns, you know, we've built are, you know, close to extremely busy streets and everything else. I don't think the noise levels are that different. But yeah, I wouldn't want to live under a flight path, that's for sure.